Eu le-am
Kind of
început,
only twice in a week.
avem moțe, s-o veni și-o mai idiot. Mă uite, ăsta nu se...
Old and tired. Old and tired.
That's why I don't come early, that's why anyway.
A fost o bună.
I forget now. Nepenthe is an old Greek. The land of Nepenthe is an ancient Greek, but I don't know the modern one. Was dreaming, sleeping and dreaming.
Sleeping and dreaming.
I forget what sleeping is.
You're not sleeping?
No, I don't know. I don't remember what the word is.
For sleeping?
Yeah.
Κοιμόσαστε. Κοιμόσαστε, well, plural.
Oh, yeah.
Κοιμάστε is, you know.
Like
So plural is
like
κοιμόσαστε.
kimesis.
Yeah, like chemises, yeah, exactly.
Κοίμησης is κοίμησης.
Yeah.
Κοίμησης is Θεοτόκο. Yeah. Κοιμάστε. Κοιμάσαι, it's, you know. Κοιμάστε is plural.
Onirevese is to dream.
Yeah.
What is it?
Onirevese.
Oh,
Yeah.
Onirevese. Like you have to make them really big, those words.
like reverie. That's where we get the word reverie.
Rêver.
Yeah, we borrow it from the
Yeah.
Greek.
Yeah.
Tovaryshi.
So I'm hiding. So then,
This is just sweet right
where are you guys sitting?
Ah, you have the
So I'm
angels.
thinking, should I lie?
We'll put them up
And I'm like, no,
I'll
I'll
have
just
to
go.
show you.
And then I'm like,
You tell
okay,
us
we're in the
the
dining room.
Yeah.
She goes, why aren't you here? I go, because there's no room. Look at it, it's all full.
She asked you?
Yeah.
I am polite, but I'm avoiding all that. I don't need it. Angela, she's suffering for instance. I want to have a house for coffee.
Oh, that's good.
She went with Elizabeth, you know, they lost their father. And sometimes sometimes she helped me with the computer. So I have her to like take her to the doctor once in a while because she has her spine. She probably has to have an operation when she's young. She doesn't want to have an operation because she won't be able to walk it. Sometimes spine. So that's.
All of us, so.
Did you close the door?
Yeah.
We went to Angela. She's a person that she doesn't talk to for anybody, anything. She's really, really nice.
That's good.
So avoiding all that stuff.
All that drama.
I don't need it. I'm polite and that's all.
Christ, Doctor, God, send down the Holy Spirit upon us and open the eyes of our hearts and our minds to that understanding of thy gospel, for thou art good and merciful and befriending God.
Amen.
Anyway, today we're going to talk about Holy Communion, and there might be a few questions this time. So, because the Eucharist, the Holy Communion, is the very center of what the liturgy is all about, really. And it's the very center of Orthodox Christian life. You know, it was a very unfortunate thing that during the past few centuries, people began to take Holy Communion only 4 times a year, in some places 1 time a year. But that is devastating to the spiritual life, because Holy Communion is the heavenly bread, the food of the Spirit, and it's the main part of our spiritual life. The whole liturgy is designed to draw us toward Holy Communion. And St. John Chrysostom had said that if you're present for the reading of the Gospel and you don't take Holy Communion, you're guilty of the body and blood of Christ. So he said, it tells us that we shouldn't just take Holy Communion any old way, but make some preparation, and especially to forgive others for receiving Holy Communion. But also, we should have some kind of preparation, whatever we feel like. So a lot of places have made different rules for preparation, and most of those rules are designed on the idea that you're only going to take communion once a year or 4 times a year. So if you're only taking communion 1 time a year or 4 times a year, then perhaps you need special preparation. And even to go to confession before, because you're taking it so seldom. The problem with that is that people would only take confession if they were going to take communion, and didn't take confession any other time. So they shouldn't be tied together because they're 2 separate things. But one elder from Maldathos told me once, he said, the best preparation for Holy Communion is Holy Communion. If you're taking it regularly, then that's the best preparation, is to understand that that's what the spiritual life is really all about. And that's the very center of our worship, and the center, that's what gives the unity of the church, is the Holy Communion. That St. Ignatius the God-bearer was writing his epistles while he was on his way to martyrdom. He said that wherever the bishop and the people are gathered for the Eucharist, for the Holy Communion, the whole fullness of the church is there. The whole fullness of the Church Catholic is there, with the bishop and the people gathered for the Eucharist. Not just for the liturgy alone, but to fulfill the liturgy by receiving communion. And some people will ask, well, how can the communion be the body and blood of Christ everywhere, at all times? And they'll say, well, if God can create us from the dust of the earth and raise us up again from the dust of the earth in the resurrection, He can certainly change the Holy Communion into the body and blood of Christ. Now, we don't say how Christ is present in the Eucharist. We don't give a scientific definition. In the West, they got carried away and came up with a teaching called transubstantiation, so that the nature of the what goes to the little wafer that they serve, so that the nature of it is changed into I don't know how you would say transubstantiation in simple words, but the substance changes, and that was getting a little bit too fine. All we can say is that by the grace of the Holy Spirit it changed, and that Christ is present in the Holy Communion. Then we receive Holy Communion with faith. When we receive it without faith, that's what the apostle meant by receiving it unworthily. Not that we can make ourselves worthy, not that the priest or the bishop can't make himself worthy either, but you are worthy through faith. After all, we live by faith. And the Apostle Paul keeps reminding us we're not under law, but we're under promise, and we're under faith. And so to approach it with faith. But the one thing that you should never approach Holy Communion if you're burning with some kind of malice or anger in your heart for somebody else. It's better just to stay away that day and try to resolve it to forgive somebody. Because you take communion for the health, for the sake of soul and body, and forgiveness of sins. But Christ says if you don't forgive, you won't be forgiven. And even in the Lord's Prayer, we ask that He forgives us to the degree that we forgive others. That even in the Lord's Prayer we make it clear, forgive us as we forgive others. So the lack of forgiveness or having malice or anger in your heart is the main thing that we should abstain from communion that day till we resolve this issue in our hearts. And sometimes we can't completely forgive someone, but we make the effort to do it anyway. We pray for strength to do it, and we take communion to help give us spiritual strength. Remember, this is the bread of heaven. This is the bread that came down from heaven. Christ said, I am the bread of life, the bread that came down from heaven. And so this is when we approach Holy Communion, it says with fear of God, faith, and love, because at that moment we have some fear about the condition of our conscience and our hearts. And so we try to resolve that in ourselves. But we shouldn't try to find excuses not to take communion. You have to have an excuse not to take it, not an excuse to take it. If you shouldn't abstain from communion unless you have a really good excuse for staying away from Holy Communion. So it's sometimes we got the idea that, well, I'll take communion, but if I have an excuse to take communion. But it should be the other way around. You have to have an excuse not to take communion. So, and really we have to trust, you can come to confession, but we have to trust that the person's own conscience, their own spiritual understanding will tell them whether they've got a problem or not, whether they shouldn't take communion that day. It's a matter of your own conscience and between you and God. But the priest can't always just give you a magic blessing to take communion. You can, if you feel like you needed to confess that day and you come, you're not able to get to confession first, then you get a blessing from the priest and go to communion afterwards. But the prayer after communion isn't absolutely necessary for taking communion. It's not a magic prayer. It's a prayer that announces God's forgiveness for what you've confessed. It's not a special blessing to take communion. And that's why we should go to confession even when we're not going to take communion. Confession should be at least once a month to help keep us on the path, help us to think about what our life is, and help us to sort of cleanse ourselves, to lift the burden of our conscience off our shoulders. But Holy Communion really is the center. The Eucharist is the center of Christian life. And we take it very seriously, and it's surrounded by the whole liturgy, which is all the first part of the liturgy up to communion is our preparation for communion. And it's the psalms that we sing are to put us in the right mental framework for communion, and all the prayers leading up to it, the symbol of faith, our confession that we make from our heart, is expression of our faith that allows us to take communion. So that's how we should see the liturgy, as the magnet that's drawing us toward communion. That's, the reading of the Gospel is important. The sermon is important, but that isn't the whole message. Even the sermon helps to lead us toward communion. That's why the sermon should be liturgical. We shouldn't preach on the gospel, apostle, or major feast day, but never bring things outside the church into the sermon. You know, sometimes people make I think, big mistake. They tear the fabric of the liturgy by talking about social issues or things that are in the world and outside the church, when they're really supposed to be explaining the meaning of the Holy Gospel to us, the meaning of the epistle reading, and the meaning of a major feast day, because the whole liturgy is about meaning. There are other times you can talk about other issues, but not in the sermon. That's I hear people preaching, I've mentioned this before, we hear people preaching hate-filled sermons or angry sermons, or sermons that are all about fear, or about God getting revenge on us or something, and that's not appropriate. That's not a part of what the liturgy is about. So the sermon should be liturgical and in the framework of the liturgy itself. That we should be preaching what the liturgy preaches, and preaching the meaning of the gospel and how it applies to your life, the meaning of the epistles of Apostle Paul and how it applies to your life, and what is our hope and expectation based on the words of Jesus Christ in the liturgy. I think we're undermining the faith when we try to bring outside things into it. We're taking away from the idea that we're aiming toward the Eucharist, we're aiming toward Holy Communion. And these issues that are outside the life of the church don't bring us toward Holy Communion. In fact, some of the sermons we hear might make us really unworthy to take communion, because we'll listen to these words and we'll become angry. Our souls will become agitated, and our minds will start going over all these negative things. And before long, we're completely unworthy to take communion, because we're outside the church now. We're out there agitated, angry, and fearful. And that's no way to approach Holy Communion. That's the thing that's missing in this, is that even the sermon should help prepare us for Holy Communion, not make us in a state of mind and soul that we daren't approach Holy Communion because we're angry. And that's, I think, a big mistake that's being made some places in the church. That, you know, we somehow forget what the liturgy is actually about, and forget what the role of the people is in the liturgy. And we get angry, or the priest gets angry about something outside in the world, and then he tries to make the people angry. But in the liturgy, we should always come out with peace in our hearts. We should always come out with a peaceful mind, with a peaceful soul, with our heart at peace, not agitated. And so this is the time that we receive this peace that passes all understanding, is during the Divine Liturgy and the worship together. So, anyways, that's about all I have to say today, because we have the healing service later. But anybody have any questions about it? Yeah.
When did it start for certain local churches to take communion only once in a while? Because at the beginning, in the first centuries, it was for every liturgy.
Every single day. In fact, I think it's Timothy, I can't remember if it's Timothy of Alexandria, I believe it was Timothy, was asked if people who were possessed by demons could take communion. And he said, yes, but only once a week, not every day like other Christians. So evidently, people were taking communion every day. And John Chrysostom is already lamenting that people don't take communion as often as they should. So sometime after the Turkish conquest in Greece, and under the strong Latin influence that moved into Russia for 300 years, people started taking communion like the Latins once, about 4 times a year. Up until the 20th century, Roman Catholics couldn't take communion every Sunday, but only 4 times a year. In the 20th century, it began to change, so they could take communion regularly. But before that, so you only had her Latin influence from the Eastern Rite Catholic Church that really kind of embedded that. Even this, you know, some priests will tell you, oh, you have to read 3 canons and 3 akaphists, and prayers that last about at least an hour, 45 minutes or an hour, before you can take communion. But then, under those circumstances, people almost never take communion. And there's no canon that prescribes anything like that. It's just a local custom. In Stara Serbia, in old Serbia, now you had to fast all week on bread and water before you took communion. So nobody ever took communion. Very few people. Usually only the babas, but the bunika would take communion because they were stronger and than the younger people. So and it got to the point where if we go to visit a Serb in the hospital, we don't dare to take communion to them, because if we take them communion, they're absolutely certain they're going to die, because you only take communion before you die. And, you don't want to frighten them by doing that. You know, when we got these superstitions in Russia, they tell me, some of the priests from before the revolution, we used to know, they're all gone now, but when they would go to a house to visit somebody who's sick, they would put both feet together and hop over the threshold, because people would watch, and if the priest put his left foot over first, it meant the person was going to die, and if he put his right foot over first, it meant they were going to get well. So they had such superstitions, you know, that the priest saw it, he would hop over the threshold with both feet at the same time. And you wouldn't want to meet a priest on the street first thing in the morning, because it meant the day was going to go bad.
We had that in Romania too.
Well, you know,
We
sometimes
did, yeah.
sometimes those things were deserved. You know, we had the story, Serbian story, where The ferries,
You would think it was good.
you know, they had these platform ferries. They were going across the river, and the priest fell overboard. And so the merchant goes to the priest's wife and said, I'm sorry, but your husband drowned. Why didn't you try to save him? I kept saying, give me your hand, give me your hand. And he didn't. She said, fool, priests are used to taking, not giving. You should have said, take my hand. so sometimes some of the superstitions are merits. And I think we find priests that way today, even today. But anyway, those superstitions are what kind of kept people from taking communion regularly. And people didn't understand what it meant to be worthy or to partake unworthily, because when you say, I didn't partake because I was unworthy, then that presumes that someday you're going to be worthy. But you're never going to be worthy. I mean, I'm never going to be worthy. I have to serve the liturgy, and I have to take communion, but I'm never worthy. So you're not going to be either. So you have to take communion anyway. One of the biggest mistakes, I think, and it is a superstition, because Chrysostom tells us otherwise, that women who are having their monthlies, there's absolutely no reason why they should abstain from communion at that time. It's just a custom that's developed. And I suppose it was because they didn't have feminine hygiene products in the old days. So it was a little bit awkward. So, but St. John Chrysostom tells us, they ask him, does menstruation make a woman unclean? And he said, certainly not. Nothing makes you unclean but an evil disposition. Things that occur naturally don't make you unclean. So that got carried away to such extremes that they wouldn't even let women come into the church or kiss the icons or even say prayers in the prayer corner at home. And there's so many superstitions like this that we have to get through. Anyway, don't abstain from communion unless you have a really good excuse, a really good reason in yourself. So,
Really got one question.
yeah.
By the other hand, Mary from Egypt took communion one in her life. So what is the difference between somebody who take one in her life or in his life, or somebody who take regularly every week? At the end of the story, is it different?
Well, you know, it's the thing is, the Holy Communion gives us spiritual strength. It's supposed to give us spiritual strength. And if we take communion with understanding, we get spiritual strength from it, the strength to struggle. And that's the purpose of the liturgy, is for Holy Communion. So when we don't take it, we're completely discounting the whole purpose of the liturgy. So a person takes it only once in a lifetime, well, fine, but spiritually that's not good for you.
But if you don't feel any improvement in your life and you are taking communion every week,
Yeah.
should you take a break or should you not just keep going?
No, take communion. If you feel like there's some reason or something in your heart, your conscience tells you shouldn't, and you're not sure, you ask the priest. You can take a confession, ask the priest. But otherwise, you go to confession once a month and have communion, unless you really feel it's something in your conscience that says, don't take it that Sunday. So, but it has to be something meaningful, you know. I mean, sometimes when we have bad thoughts about somebody, we get over them, and that isn't enough. I mean, I remember when I was in high school, I dreaming of pushing my teacher down the steps, but maybe I wouldn't have taken communion then, but I probably would have waited.
Can we have meat before communion? What can we eat before we take communion?
Well, in the morning, unless you have a medical condition, not really supposed to eat anything after midnight. But, you know, it depends on if you have a medical condition, you have to take medication, you know. But generally, out of respect for the Holy Communion, we don't take anything till after communion. It's not catastrophic if you do. I was running a summer camp one year, and Peter and Paul fast was on, and the kids had never fasted before. It was our Los Angeles Serbs who were there. So I tried to keep part of the fast, as much as we thought we could do with the kids. But on the morning before they took communion of Peter and Paul, I realized the kids weren't used to it, so I had the counselors go and give them, all of them, a cup of tea or orange juice and a piece of bread, a piece of toast, because I knew that would be too much for them. They weren't used to it. So we made an exception. So there's always an economia, what we call, an exception for different purposes. But in general, we don't eat before the liturgy. So.
What about the day before, like Saturday, Friday, like 3 days before? Sometimes we hear that you shouldn't eat, you should fast 3 days before communion.
Well, in southern Greece, at least, nobody eats meat on Saturday if they're going to take communion. I haven't heard any particular reason, but anyway, it's a custom there.
Okay.
But you can eat fish, so I don't see what's the difference. In some parts of, I think in Bosnia and Herzegovina, they'll fast 3 days before. I mean, they don't, not abstinence, but they fast. And the older people eat only one meal that day for those 3 days. That's Friday, Saturday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. But there's different customs in different parts of it. And you can do whatever you feel like doing. If you want to do something special, then do it. That's good.
Platica, can we drink water though?
Yeah.
Water is okay?
Yeah. I don't see
It's
anything
funny,
wrong with
but-
having a cup of tea in the morning, but anyway, that's just my opinion.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
certainly you can drink water.
Yeah.
And I don't have any choice, I have to drink water in the altar, because it's necessary. So sometimes some things are necessary, and one shouldn't worry about them too much. Some people have to have something because if you have diabetes, for example, you're going to have some carbohydrate in the morning. So there's all kinds of variation. Nothing is, so we don't have the kind of absoluteness that the Latins had before, because they don't have the principle of economia. You know, there's a word called akrivia, it means very strict. And economia means that, well, because of certain circumstances, you can't do that. So we would say strictness requires that you not eat anything after midnight. But it's economia, if you have diabetes, or you have to take pills, you have to take food with them. And so it's not really, everything's not quite so concrete. You know. That's one thing we have to avoid, being careless and avoid being legalistic, both. Somewhere there's a royal road in the middle. Almost everything, there's a royal road in the middle of two extremes. So we try to keep on the royal road down the middle.
My medication helps me to go for communion because I have to take it on empty stomach. So
Yeah.
5 o'clock in the morning.
Oh.
So.
Well, at 7 o'clock in the morning, I have to take 3 medications. So I have
Just
to.
one, but it's.
Yeah, my stomach will burn all day if I don't have something. So I do.
Oh yeah.
You know, so I have the minimum what I need, but I have to have something. Yeah. Anybody else? Okay. So we just we hear too many stories and superstitions about these things, and some things nobody can tell us why, and nobody can give us a reason. We should suspect maybe there's something wrong. If they can't give us a reason, maybe there's something wrong. If you say, oh, we have to fast on bread and water all week in order to become worthy, but you're not worthy even if you fasted for a month. So that's just it. We accept that God, you know, in the first antiphon, He remembers that we're dust. He remembers how weak we are, how messed up we are as human beings. So He's not holding us to the standard of say, one of the angels, Michael or Gabriel or something. He's holding us only to our human condition. And Christ became man, walked among us, took on our human nature, fully understands us in our nature, and he demonstrated, of course he always understood us, but he demonstrated to us that we can not be so fearful because he understands us perfectly. And, if we decided to beat our children every time they displease us, leave them bloody or something, well, it'd be one thing, we don't. So our Father in heaven doesn't either. So, a real Father, everybody who pops out of seminary, the day they come out of seminary, they might be 25 years old or something, and they think they're a spiritual father. But one of the tests is that a spiritual father doesn't want to, no father or mother wants to, well, some mothers do, but wants to control and manipulate their kids. You want your children to be better than you are. And, it's a kind of a neurosis when you try to control your children and keep them depending on you. So you want them to be independent beings. So somebody who thinks they're a spiritual father, who wants to keep everybody dependent on them, is not the real thing. Not the real thing. Even a duchovnik is not the real thing if he wants to make you dependent on them. To teach you something, fine, but not to make you dependent on them. Nobody comes between you and Christ. Nobody stands between you and Christ. That's something, the path is open. The spiritual path is open between you and Christ. So, and we need to understand that our relationship with God is one of Abba, Father. It's like calling him Tata. Yeah. So, Abba is, it means really like, not, I don't know what you say in Romanian, not Otaț, but Tata. It's closer, more intimate.
Tata, părinte,
Yeah, it's more
părinte,
intimate.
tata.
Yeah. So, that's, anyway. So that'll be it then.
It is surely meet to call thee blessed Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure and the Mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, and more glorious the uncompared than the seraphim. Without corruption thou givest birth to God the Word. True Theotokos, we magnify thee. Glory to Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, now and ever, and unto ages of ages. Amen. Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy, Lord have mercy, Laudicale.
God is with us by his grace and love for mankind, always, now and ever, and unto ages of ages.
Lord